Hey everyone, welcome back to your channel, Virgo. Um, if this message has found its way to you right now, in this particular moment, at this specific point in your journey, it's worth paying attention to. Not because there's anything magical about timing, not because fate has orchestrated this encounter, but because sometimes we're drawn to exactly what we need to hear when we're finally ready to hear it. And you might be standing at one of those thresholds right now. Something is shifting in the invisible architecture of your life. The days ahead carry a particular quality, not destiny, not predetermined outcomes, but potential, like a door that's been locked for months is suddenly vulnerable to opening. Like energy that's been stuck is beginning to move. Like patterns that have held you in place are loosening their grip just enough that you could slip free if you chose to. And the window for that choice, for that movement, it feels compressed, urgent, like there's a natural rhythm unfolding and you're being invited to sync with it rather than resist it. You might already be sensing this as restlessness, as an inability to settle into your usual routines, as thoughts that won't stop circling, as dreams that feel more vivid than normal, as a pull toward something you can't quite name but can definitely feel. What makes this moment significant isn't what will happen to you, it's what might happen through you if you let it, if you stop bracing against change, if you release the grip you've been maintaining on how things are supposed to unfold, if you allow yourself to be moved by the current that's already flowing rather than exhausting yourself trying to swim against it. And I know that might sound vague, might feel too abstract to be useful, but specificity isn't always what's needed. Sometimes what's needed is permission. Permission to trust what you're sensing even when you can't see the full picture. Permission to act on intuition even when logic hasn't caught up yet. Permission to let something end or begin or transform without having every detail figured out in advance. This reflection invites you to consider, what have you been resisting that's been trying to shift? And what would it cost you to keep resisting versus what might open up if you stopped? Some of you are carrying conversations you need to have, words that have been sitting in your throat for weeks or months, truths you've been too afraid to speak because speaking them would change everything. And the pressure of that unspoken truth, the weight of carrying what needs to be said, it's been building, creating tension in your body, making it hard to be fully present anywhere because part of you is always managing what you're not saying. And it may feel as though the coming days are presenting you with an opening, a moment where the conditions are right, where the person you need to speak to is available, where your own courage is accessible in a way it hasn't been, where the risk of speaking finally feels less dangerous than the cost of continued silence. Others are facing decisions that have been delayed, choices you've been putting off because all the options feel flawed or scary or irreversible. And the limbo of not choosing, the exhaustion of staying suspended between possibilities, it's taking more energy than actually choosing would. But choosing requires accepting that you can't control outcomes, that you might pick wrong, that even the right choice might involve loss or discomfort or uncertainty. And what if the coming days are offering you clarity? Not external clarity in the form of perfect information, but internal clarity, a knowing that rises up from somewhere deeper than logic, a sense of rightness that doesn't need to be justified or explained, a readiness to commit to a direction even without guarantees about where it leads. There's also something here about closure, about cycles completing, about chapters ending not with dramatic finality, but with quiet recognition that you've learned what you came to learn, that you've been holding on to something past its expiration date, that what once served you has become a weight, and the grace of letting it go, of acknowledging it's time to release, that grace might be more accessible right now than it's been in a long time. It can seem as if the universe has been gently loosening your grip for weeks, creating small moments where you've practiced letting go, where you've survived not being in control, where you've discovered that loosening your hold doesn't mean losing yourself. And now, in these specific days ahead, you might reach a point where full release becomes possible, where you can finally set down what you've been carrying and walk away lighter. This reflection invites you to consider: is less than hash zero, 5 hash is greater than. What would your life look like if you were no longer carrying the weight of this particular thing? And does that vision frighten you or call to you? Some of you have been waiting for permission, for a sign, for external validation that it's okay to want what you want, or choose what you're drawn to, or walk away from what's draining you. And maybe this is that permission, not from me, not from any authority outside yourself, but from the part of you that already knows what's right and has just been waiting for the rest of you to catch up, for the noise to quiet enough that you can hear that knowing voice clearly. And it may feel as though the coming days are creating that quiet, that space, that pause between what was and what could be, where old stories lose their grip, where future fears don't have quite as much power, where you're just present, just available, just ready to move when the moment asks you to move. There's a vulnerability in timing, in the idea that certain windows open and close, that opportunities for change or connection or breakthrough exist in concentrated moments rather than being equally available all the time. And I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying you'll miss your one chance if you don't act by Sunday night. Life doesn't work like that. Growth doesn't have deadlines in that way. But there is something to the idea of momentum, of energy that builds and then naturally wants to be expressed, of internal readiness that, if not acted on, can fade back into uncertainty. Not because the universe is punishing you for hesitating, but because courage is hard to sustain indefinitely, because clarity can get clouded again by overthinking, because windows that open can close not through some cosmic mechanism, but simply through the return of habitual fear or doubt or protection. So maybe what the coming days offer isn't your only chance, but maybe they offer your easiest chance, your most supported chance. Your chance when the resistance is lowest and the current is strongest, and moving with it requires less force than it usually does. And recognizing that, honoring that, that's not about pressure or scarcity. That's about efficiency, about working with natural rhythms rather than always having to work against them. Um, think about water. It doesn't flow constantly at the same rate. It has moments of surge, moments where the tide is with you and moving forward takes minimal effort, and other moments where you'd be fighting upstream and progress would be slow and exhausting. Neither moment is wrong, but one is clearly wiser to act in than the other. This reflection invites you to consider, what action have you been postponing that, somewhere inside you're actually ready for now? Some of you might be experiencing this around relationships, a dynamic that's been stuck in a particular pattern for months or years, where you know something needs to shift, but neither person has been willing to disturb the status quo. And maybe the energy of these coming days creates just enough disruption, just enough opening that a real conversation becomes possible, that honesty becomes accessible. That change becomes less terrifying than continued stagnation. And that conversation, if it happens, might not be comfortable, might not lead to the outcome you're hoping for, might reveal things that are hard to hear, but it will move energy that's been stagnant, will create clarity where there's been confusion, will let both people stop living in the ambiguous space between what is and what's pretended. Others might feel this around work or purpose or creative expression, something you've been wanting to start or share or commit to but haven't because the fear of judgment or failure or visibility has been too strong. And what if the coming days offer you a moment where that fear is just slightly quieter, where your desire to create or express or contribute is just slightly louder, where the gap between wanting and doing feels crossable in a way it hasn't? Because creation requires momentum, requires that first scary step that makes all the subsequent steps possible. And sometimes we wait our whole lives for the fear to completely disappear before we take that step. But fear doesn't disappear. It just sometimes gets quiet enough that we can move anyway. And recognizing those moments of relative quiet, of reduced resistance, that's the skill. There's also something here about reconciliation, about bridges that have been burned or neglected, about connections you've let fade because maintaining them felt too hard or too painful or too complicated. And maybe for some of you, these coming days present a natural opportunity to reach out, to say the thing you've been thinking, to acknowledge the silence, to extend an olive branch without having to make it into something huge and dramatic and laden with expectation. It can seem as if the universe occasionally creates moments where reaching across distance feels less risky than it usually does, where pride or hurt or time can be set aside just long enough to remember why the connection mattered in the first place. And whether that reach is received the way you hope or not, there's value in the reaching itself, in no longer living with the weight of words unsaid. This reflection invites you to consider, if you could speak to one person with complete honesty and zero fear of consequences, what would you say and to whom? Some of you might be thinking this doesn't apply to you, that nothing in your life feels particularly urgent or threshold like, that these coming days look like every other set of days. And that might be true. Not every message is for everyone. Not every moment carries the same intensity for all people. But maybe pay attention anyway. Maybe notice what shows up, what thoughts persist, what impulses arise, what small openings present themselves. Because transformation doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it shows up as a subtle pull towards something slightly different. Sometimes it looks like a random conversation that ends up being exactly what you needed. Sometimes it's just a shift in perspective so quiet you almost miss it, but that changes everything downstream. There's a quality to these coming days that feels like permission. Like the world is giving you a little extra space to be messy or uncertain or in process. Like the usual judgment or pressure or expectation has been turned down just a notch. And in that reduced intensity, in that gentler atmosphere, you might find it easier to be honest with yourself, to admit what's not working, to acknowledge what you actually want versus what you think you're supposed to want, to let yourself be human and flawed and still worthy of good things. And that honesty, that self acceptance, it creates the foundation for real change, not performative change, not change that's about becoming someone you're not, but change that's about removing the layers of protection and pretense that have been keeping you from being fully yourself. It may feel as though you've been in rehearsal for something, living adjacent to your real life rather than fully in it, going through motions, playing roles, doing what's expected without questioning whether it's what's actually right. And what if these coming days are an invitation to step out of rehearsal, to decide that this right now is the actual performance? That you don't need to wait for perfect conditions or complete preparedness or total certainty before you start living with full presence and intention? Because there's always going to be a reason to wait, always going to be something that's not quite ready, always going to be a version of the future that feels safer or more manageable than the present. But waiting has a cost. Living in preparation mode indefinitely has a cost. And at some point, the cost of not beginning exceeds the risk of beginning badly. Some of you are being called to be braver than you've been, not reckless, not careless, but brave, to speak when silence would be easier, to choose when remaining undecided would feel safer, to be visible when hiding would be more comfortable, to risk rejection or judgment or failure because the alternative, staying protected and small and uninvested, that alternative has become unbearable. And bravery doesn't mean not being afraid, it means being afraid and moving anyway. It means feeling the tremor in your hands and speaking the words anyway. It means knowing you might fail and trying anyway. It means accepting that you can't control how others respond and showing up anyway. This reflection invites you to consider what's the bravest thing you could do in the next few days and what's stopping you from doing it. Others are being called to rest, to stop, to cease the constant striving and producing and proving, to let yourself be unproductive, to acknowledge that you've been running on empty, that the pace you've been maintaining isn't sustainable, that something in you is asking, maybe even begging, for a pause, for space, for permission to not be okay, to not have answers, to not be making visible progress. And that rest, that stopping, it might be the most radical thing you could do, more radical than any action, because your worth isn't tied to your productivity. Your value doesn't depend on constant forward motion. And the culture might tell you otherwise, but the culture is exhausted and sick and disconnected, and you don't have to participate in that sickness anymore. There's also something here about trust, about the way we exhaust ourselves trying to orchestrate outcomes, trying to control variables, trying to ensure things unfold the way we think they should unfold. And what if these coming days are inviting you to practice a different way, to set your intention, to make your choice, to take your action, and then to release your grip on what happens next? To trust that You don't have to micromanage reality for things to work out. That effort and force aren't the only paths to good outcomes. That sometimes surrender and flow are actually more effective than constant striving. Um, and I know that's hard, especially if control has been your primary survival strategy, especially if letting go feels like giving up, especially if trust has been repeatedly violated and caution feels like wisdom. But there's a difference between healthy boundaries and rigid control, between discernment and fear based restriction. And maybe part of what these days are offering is practice in distinguishing between those things. So as you move through the coming days, stay awake, stay aware, not in an anxious, hypervigilant way, but in an open, receptive way. Notice what pulls your attention. Notice what resistance arises. Notice what excites you, even if it scares you. Notice what you keep thinking about when your mind is allowed to wander. Notice what emerges in conversation or in dreams or in the quiet moments between tasks. Because guidance doesn't usually come as thunderbolts or burning bushes. It comes as whispers, as nudges, as recurring themes, as quiet knowing that's easy to dismiss or override with logic, and learning to recognize and honor that knowing, even when it doesn't make complete sense yet. That's how you navigate threshold moments. That's how you move from one chapter to the next without dragging all the old patterns with you. And if Sunday night arrives and you haven't taken some dramatic action, that's okay too. This isn't about creating artificial pressure or manufacturing false urgency. It's about awareness, about recognizing that you're in a moment where certain kinds of movement are more possible than usual, where certain conversations are more accessible, where certain changes require less force. And whether you take advantage of that possibility or not, you're still exactly where you need to be. Still learning what you came here to learn, still growing at exactly the pace that's right for you. But don't let fear pretend to be wisdom. Don't let protection pretend to be prudence. Don't let the voice that's kept you small and safe convince you it's serving your highest good when it's really just serving your familiar comfort. You know the difference. You feel the difference. And whatever's asking to move through you right now, whatever's trying to shift or release or emerge, it's asking for a reason. It's ready for a reason. You're ready for a reason. Trust that, honor that, and let yourself move.